Hello, everyone. I'm Gemma Star, and welcome to another episode of Man Speak. Man Speak is an offshoot to the Heart Warrior series, where some of our Heart Warriors come back and we talk about a whole subject that they are passionate about. And today is no exception because we have the return of our number 24 Heart Warrior, who is Sacha Stone. And we're going to be talking about poetry. Now, Sacha is a brilliant mind. He's an architect, a geometer of our emerging new earth, but he's also a divine poet and amazing wordsmith. And for those who don't know me, I also write poetry. So this is going to be a fascinating discussion and one very close to both of our hearts. So enjoy. Hey, Sacha, welcome back to Man Speak. Thanks for coming.
Great pleasure. Thank you. It's a bit of a drizzly day here in Istanbul. I'm just on my way to the airport to head to Romania in just after this interview. I'll be running out the door, but very happy to catch up with you.
Oh, amazing. Thank you. And the subject for today is poetry, one which I know is close to your heart and mine. So, and the title that you chose was Surfing the Space Between Words. And I'd just like to start by reading the first four lines of one of your poems, which talks about this. And so we arrive at that place between words where nothing is said, yet everything heard. So what is that space between words?
It's the still point. It's the transcendent axis from the lateral plane into the vertical, into the ascendancy, so to speak. It's the touchstone of the beloved, which is the marriage point of Alpha Omega, of all aspects of duality. It couldn't be more profound. Having said that, the door's just gone because my lunch has just arrived. So talk about space between words. This is also a space between words. It won't take longer than 5 seconds, but by all means, read some poetry.
I'll just pause. Did you have anything else to say around that, Sacha?
No, I think I covered the entire universal fabric of creation in that. No, Alpha Omega, it's all that is, all that ever was, all that ever shall be. And that's why for me it's the perennial theme. It's the theme that reemerges and reemerges through poetry. And the reason why I'm so devoted and to some extent addicted to poetry is because that is the beginnings of a language which takes us away from the from suffrage, in the temporal space into the transcendent, which is where we no longer identify with time and motion, but we situate ourselves within the throne of witness, which doesn't feel pain because it doesn't identify with anything. It simply observes in a non-judgmental and non-condemnatory way all that exists. And that's really the closest we get to being fully aligned with the Godhead, with divinity. And that's why for me poetry is important, because it brings us to that still point.
Yeah, I mean, this conversation came up for us in our last episode of Man Speak, and I re-listened to the bit that you were saying about poetry, and you said to me, poetry is a very important transmutation and to some extent transcendent medium. I would say the most important. So, I mean, I know you're a sculptor and an artist and a musician, but you're saying poetry is the most important. Why is that?
By far, there's no question about that. Cut my hands off, cut everything else off, but don't disassociate me from the imperative of finding the space between words vital. Words are expression, the accreted grunts and squawks that we make in order to express soul in the Luciferic realm of time space. And in this realm, we're seeking to elevate ourselves and others. We're seeking to conjure and to alchemize the baseline of our reality into a higher outcome, and use our life force and our expression as the medium to do so. Nothing could be more important. And when you've arrived at poetry, and you understand the use of syntax and placement of word or situation of word and of meaning, where it's no longer the word, it's the space between the words that actually enchants and that does the conjuring. I don't want to get lost in the words describing wordlessness here, and I'm about to do so, and I'll fall over backwards. But I hope that what I've said elicits the importance of poetry, because to me it is profoundly important. I'll put it this way. And bad poets should be lined up and shot. I've said this from day one. There's no excuse for bad poetry. But I guess practice poetry is acceptable, but do it really on your own. And then only come forward when, or don't even come forward. I don't come forward. I kind of spit poetry into the wind. And most of my poems, 90% of them, just curl up and roll up and dissolve into nothingness. So I don't collect even my own poems don't matter to me once they've been writ. It's not that one wants to create an anthology of poetry particularly. It's the business of writing the poem, of being in that space. In the writing of it is the gifting of the frequency. Let's talk about frequency. Words are frequency, expression is frequency, everything is frequency. And I think that poetry is the last step toward the psionic and the telepathic actualization of the human spirit in the temporal realm. I think that we'll all be poets moments before we move into the collective enlightenment, into the vertical ascension event, which is coming. I think that the eve of that, we will all be poets. We will all be thinking and feeling and confluencing within the realm of poetry. To my mind, that's for sure what happens. It's what happens to people on the eve of their death. People who are just about to depart this world move into a very, very profound, prophetic, kind of reductivist approach to life. Everything gets pulled into the now, and the use of breath and words becomes so very important. Anyone who's been at the deathbed of someone knows what I'm saying. It becomes the most important use of word. Famous last words are famous for a reason, because they're generally the most important words that are ever spoken.
So, Sacha, did you study poetry? Can you give us a bit of a background to your relationship with poetry?
No, I've never studied anything in that sense. No, I haven't, and I don't know that there's such a thing as studying poetry, but I'm more or less familiar with poetry. I've familiarized myself with great poets, especially in my teens and early 20s. I did some reading at that time. I stopped reading a long time ago and haven't read subsequent to that. And I've never bought a book of poetry to speak of. But, William Blake was a very, very impactful on me as a youngster, as a child. Ezra Pound was very, very important to me as a child. And I could cite 200 or 300 poets if I sat with it for long enough. And there are so many. I mean, the family of poets is that we could refer. I mean, I looked up earlier today before this conversation with you. I wanted to just refresh myself as to who are the most important poets in history. Now, of course, surprise, surprise, in Google up comes a bunch of white poets. That's it. There was one black face, of course, that was Maya Angelou, but it starts off with William Shakespeare, somebody who by best accounts didn't even exist. Walt Whitman, a kind of central tenet to middle America today. William Wordsmith, a seminal icon to middle England today. William Blake, a seminal influence in the transcendent milieu of moving from Victoriana into the next expression at the collective level. So William Blake became very axiomatic as a poet, not just in England, but around the world. Edgar Allan Poe, similarly, and Mark Twain in the United States become seminal, poets in the same context. John Keats and John Milton, sort of precursors to William Blake, very, very important poets. And like I said, Ezra Pound, to me, vital. Man ended up in a mental asylum, having been put there by the status quo, because his poetry ultimately was the best kind of poetry. It was so revolutionary. It was challenging the fabric of the day, and to an extent that he inflamed the sensibilities of people enormously. Maya Angelou, very important American Black poet. I don't really forgive her for fawning over Barack Obama and buying into that liberalist shit, but God forgive her. She was an old woman and can be forgiven for that. And so goes Sylvia Plath, characters like her and Dylan Thomas, the kind of Welsh poets who were shock poets, important poets, but tragic, comic. I mean, their lives were devastated, rack and ruin. Oscar Wilde, also very important man, an icon, who died in ignominy in a fucking hotel somewhere in the outer fringes of Paris, from some sexually transmitted disease, I think it was. And God love Oscar Wilde, such an incredible wordsmith. Even the last words he uttered should echo throughout eternity. I think the last words he uttered as he looked up from his deathbed in this ghastly little hotel room, he said, "Either the wallpaper goes or I go." And of course, he died, And he was an aesthetician, a man who elevated beauty above all things. Then you've got Yeats and Pablo Neruda, very, very important poet as well. These kind of revolutionary poets. You talk about the most important revolutionary poet, to my mind, is Garcia Lorca, the Spanish revolutionary poet, who's been also a huge inspiration to me. What his life represented. He was such a threat to the status quo. They lined him up against a wall and shot him in the heart, for his poetry. Rudyard Kipling, very important poet, again, Kipling. And so it goes on and on and on. I mean, I could speak ad infinitum about poets in the last century. I'm not familiar with ones that were in medieval days. There were sort of doggerel poets there that set the standard of the day, but I can't really speak to them. What I would do is say that the greatest exemplar of poetry that I can conjure would probably be Rumi, the great Sufic poet. And that's, I think, because his prose and his poetry was so distilled, so refined, so transcendent, that it cast effectively the thrall of an entire civilization and culture and religion. Islam essentially emerges off the mystical traditions of Islam, which you could look to Sufism for. So Rumi becomes profoundly important as a poet.
Do all those poets, like, because I don't know most of them, the only one I studied at school was John Donne, a metaphysical poet, and for some reason I remember him. But like, do all those poets, would you say, are they writing poetry through their heart? Because we did talk a bit about this in the last show, the difference, like we both agreed that when our poetry comes through, it comes through the heart, as opposed to, you know, writing a scholastic essay with the mind. Do all those poets, would you say, good poetry, does it always come through the heart? And is it channeled through us, or is it written by us?
So I'm going to just start off by disagreeing. And because in a sense, we're going back to the conversation that we had, which I enjoyed on the subject. But no, good poetry doesn't come from the heart. Good poetry must issue from a synthesis of heart, mind. And again, that's when the mind negates the intellect negates the emotionality, and the emotionality negates the intellectuality. And so when emotion and intellect come together in phase coherence, which means to say balanced, then they phase one another out. And that becomes the transcendent point. That becomes the conduit and the access point to what you would call Godhead or divinity or divine inspiration or aspiration. And then, yes, then we get into the arena of, or the discourse of, is that a am I doing it, or am I channeling it? Which, well, ultimately there's no difference or distinction between the two. When you are fully being in the doing of the being of the doing of who you be and who you do in the now, then you are at that transcendent point. You're in that still point as an actualized human. And let's just touch on that for a moment, because this is the point, and this is the point of this conversation, and the point of this subject. It's the point of poetry itself, is for us to arrive at that phase conjugate space between this and that, between polarity and duality. Why was Garcia Lorca's poetry so profound? Because the status quo of the day during the Spanish Revolution, the powers that be couldn't touch it. They couldn't tap into it. They couldn't comprehend it, for sure, but they couldn't control it, because the way that Garcia Lorca communicated through poetry was beyond the control of any culture or any standard of the day. That was the point, and that was why he was such a threat, and that was why the only way to deal with him was to kill him, which they did with a bullet through the heart. And why does Garcia Lorca's life exemplify the very best of revolutionaryism, and the very best of poetry, and the very best of mortal transcendence? It's because he lived, breathed, and died to the atom seed of that flame of pure truth, which, as I've mentioned over the years, is connected to what he coined, something called duende, or the duende line, which is the indivisible line upon which the angel and the devil do combat for the mortal soul. Think about that. The duende line is that indivisible line upon which the angel and the devil do combat for the mortal soul. That's powerful stuff. That describes the essence of the angelic human being and our struggle and our trial of separation. It describes the battleground of the human heart and mind, the human being, the duende line. It describes the place wherein we define pure truth, wherein we hear the chorus of our own conscience, and wherein we re-identify with our own divinity, and thereby have what it takes to move into our ascendancy, whether it's in the mortal sense as becoming a better human being, a more spiritualized being, or whether indeed it's equipping ourselves for death and for moving into the next realm of expression in the most perfect way possible. So it's very, very important stuff. I don't want to wax on too long on the subject. I'm just trying to give a sense of rationale as to why poetry is so important. It defines culture. Ultimately, it defines reality.
Love it. So, Sacha, when you write poetry, because I want to understand if it's sort of the same as what happens with me. Like, what are the moments, what's happening in the moments leading up to you writing a poem?
So I'm schooled at songwriting, and I did that for so many years, from my teens or throughout my 20s until about 29, or I think was more or less when I retired from music. But for sure, there was a period of 12, 13 years where all I was concerned about was lyrics and lyricism and situating prose with music. And so I composed music and wrote the prose, and that was my discipline, was songwriting. So I got to a point, I think, or a plateau within my own capacity to write poetry, where it became very, very second nature. It's like if you do know how to play a violin, you pick it up and you go straight into it. And the thing will sing in your hands if you're good at it. But similarly, you practice enough in lyrics and lyricism and poetry, and it ultimately entrains your mind into moving into that place of surrender, where the intellect is not trying to lead the process. Trust me, if the intellect tries to lead the process, you'll fuck it up and you'll fall over backwards, and it'll be what I define as bad poetry. And again, I say take them out and shoot them for that. But the same thing with bad music. A bad sound, a bad song, a singer, a bad piece of musical composition is venal. It's the most horrendous thing. It's antithetical to the elevation of art or beauty or consciousness. It's actually a desecration of beauty, art, and consciousness. And all too many people have no idea how to compose or make music or write poetry or sculpt or paint. And yet they afflict themselves and the world with bad poetry and bad music and bad images. So I just have to try and draw a blind down and pay little attention to that. And we could get into the realm of art and speak about, everyone from Toulouse-Lautrec to Kandinsky, and what defines a good artist, what defines a good painter, what defines a good sculptor. Well, you know the answer to that. You go to an art museum, or you see the image of a Turner painting, and if you're not moved by that, you are as subhuman. You do not have empathy or compassion, or you're not actualized if you can look at a Turner painting without being profoundly moved by it. That's just a fact. That's just a fact. So similarly with poetry, the right stuff connects through frequencies, and those frequencies are all contained within what you would call the empathic waveform of frequency sets, because it's I am that thou art. A good poet speaks to the universal theme of the trial of separation. A good poet can only speak to the theme of the beloved, and continuously play with that theme of identifying or re-identifying what the beloved is, who the beloved is. Let's just go back in history a little bit. We discussed Rumi, and Rumi with the Masnavi, which was a epic, I think a 6-volume series of poetry, which was referred to by many as the Quran in Persian. But that's Rumi's most famous poem, and it's over 50,000 lines long, and all it does is teaches Sufis how to find love in devotion, in reverence, in their affinity to God. That's all it does. So it's a restatement, again, an identification and a re-identification. It's a feedback loop that just constantly explores the thematic of the beloved. And it's that powerful. It became the genesis point for an entire civilization. And with the master Jesus, or Yeshua, you've got, coming from the man from Gethsemane's own lips, you could ascribe, I am the way, the truth, and the light, and the life. So that becomes the seminal message of Jesus. I am the way, the truth, and the light. And no one comes to the Father except me, and so it goes on. But what he's essentially saying in poetry, in prose, there, again, epochal prose, is I am that I am, and claiming himself as the Son of God, as all of us should do and must do, except for the idiot Christians who fell into idolatry and are addicted to doctrine and dogma. And they think that anyone saying I'm a son or a daughter of God is a heretic and should be shot or burned at the stake. So 98% plus of all Christians historically have been idolaters and continue to this day to be idolaters. 98% by best accounts of good, quote unquote, Muslims are themselves heretics against the true message of the Prophet Muhammad, peace upon him, who was an extraordinary being, and who elicited in the same way that the man from Gethsemane or Nazareth did, also elicited beautiful one-liners that codified all of what became the religion, was codified just in a few words by these great masters, these great saints. But you take Jesus, for instance, speaking about I am the way, the truth, and the light, and then you've got the bastardization of Jesus's prose, the complete bastardization of everything that was sacred in the utterances of the man from Nazareth, were codified then in the worst sense by the Jesuits and the Jesuitical element, which is the Black Sabbatean genesis of evil that emerged through the bosom of the Roman Catholic Church. And they came out with ad majorem Dei gloriam, I think, which was the Jesuit code for the greater glory of God, for the greater glory of God. So not I am the way, I embody, enact, and manifest as the Son of God or the daughter of God. No, for the greater glory of God. The Jesuits flipped it into that, which is idolatry. So they could say, for the greater glory of God, the holy war, go that direction, chop off all their heads, or for the greater good of God, let's systemically poison humanity with a genocidal agenda through the pharmaceutical industry, which incidentally is exactly what the Jesuits did promise and pledge to do hundreds of years ago, which they've done. So do you see what I'm saying? Words become so important, and how one sees and understands the space between words is where you define the truth between them. In Buddhism, you could look at the greatest teaching of Buddhism is, simply put, if you find the Buddha on your path, kill him. So that one line emerges as being the single most important teaching about Buddhism, certainly in my view, as a poet, because it's perfectly true. That one line perfectly distills Buddhism into what it should be, which is not pursuing idolatry. Thou shalt not pursue the idol and then have a statue of the Buddha and a bunch of beads and a bunch of mantras and mandalas that you start to worship in a ritualistic fashion, which has become latter-day Buddhism. It's idolatry. Don't even start me on Hinduism, the most idolatrous religion on the face of the earth, and a very interesting one culturally, to be sure. So for me, you now get to what I have arrived at, which is pure truth and right action in the living moment, is the path of least resistance to the highest outcome, always in all ways. And I define that line as my ultimate offering of poetry or prose, because I happen to know that that is the distillation of all that is judicious and righteous and godly about all the scriptures and the mystical traditions. I'm concerned about today, contemporaneously today. This is my age, my era. I'm not a dead soul speaking. I'm a living soul speaking, as are you. And what we say matters. And the words that we use matter. But what matters more is the space between the words, because that's where the spirit flows, and that's where the frequency of our words either attracts or repels. Be sure of that. And I'll leave it at that before I continue and silence you altogether.
There was something else that you said in the last show. I did write it down. You said you can't be a good poet if you have an ego. They don't go hand in hand. Can you expand on that, please, Sacha?
Absolutely, absolutely. And I'll just underscore what I've been saying, but with a slight change in trajectory. An egoist is not able to express in concert with divinity. It can't happen. It's why egos, God loved them, become other kinds of animals in this world. Donald Trump is a classic example of it. He's an extraordinary man, and one that I personally love. A couple of things I don't forgive, which I've spoken about, the vaccine agenda and so on. Don't understand that shit, but I love the character, I love the man, and there's nothing I condemn about him. There's nothing I would judge or condemn. But similarly with other men, of his ilk. But he is not a poet. Be sure of that. He's many things, but he's not a poet. Elon Musk is another latter-day icon, and he's very brilliant in his way. He's anything but a poet. He's not a poet. He's profound in some of the things he says, and his syntax is certainly very enlightened oftentimes, but he's not a poet. So the greatest accomplishers in the world invariably are not poets per se, But I'm not sure if I'm approaching the answer to your question. Forgive me.
No, that's fine. Thank you. So when you write poetry, Sacha, I was thinking about why when I write poetry, and I thought there's usually three reasons. Either I'm processing something because I'm feeling emotional turmoil and I take it to that zero space and just express it, or I'm wanting to say something to someone else that I can't maybe say in another way, and so I write it in poetry, or I want to capture a moment in time, immortalize a moment in time. What about you?
It's in me, it's always going to be, again, a regurgitation of the same thematic, which is my relationship with the beloved. And of course, if one is in love, for instance, and the object of desire, especially unrequited love, is the greatest catalyst for poetry. No question about that. A broken heart is an essential catalyzing factor for good poetry, but that's because the broken heart is symptomatic and totemistic of the death of ego. How do we have our hearts broken? Well, through unrequited love, which means that she left me because she doesn't love me anymore, or he left me because he doesn't love me anymore. Therefore, I'm not good enough, and I'm lacking, and self-worth comes up, and all the horrors of not being relevant and not being rich enough or beautiful enough, or all those elements enter in to become the confluence that brings about a destruction of ego, which is ultimately a very good thing. So then the ego falls into this abyss. Well, if it's a sensible one, it dies to itself. If it's a stupid ego, it'll simply resort to more drink and drugs and addictions in order to blindside itself from its own shadow. But the sensible individual dies a death through the broken heart, becomes a kind of pedestrian shamanic ritual. And we've all suffered from that. Most 13, 14, 15-year-olds suffer from it. And it hurts badly at time. I can tell you it doesn't get any better with age. Heartbreak is heartbreak is heartbreak. But one does write, you're right, one does elicit poetry as a means of communicating to the other, invariably the beloved. But that's, again, that's not really ground zero of the poetry, because ground zero is not connected to the icon of the unrequited love. Ground zero is when we've transposed the folly of the heartbreak or the unrequited love. We've transposed that in as a fractal of the greater heartbreak, which is the trial of separation of the whole of humanity, the great fall, so to speak, which is the primal trauma, or so we're engineered genetically and psycho-civilizationally to believe in a great fall. And so there's that, which becomes the genesis point of our sense of loss and sense of sorrow, and sense of unrequited connection to divinity. You're right. But the fractal is the fractal, and it's not ground zero of poetry. Ground zero is when we fall into the atom seed of the human experience, the human condition, and we truly, the heart breaks, the true heart, the rose heart, the heart of the Magdalene. When that heart, the Christed heart, that's the one that needs to break in a sense. And ground zero is where that heart, I don't want to say break, it opens up. It opens up. But the process of getting there is the greatest sacrifice any of us can make, because we have to move beyond temporal love of the spouse or the beloved husband, wife, lover. That story, it becomes folly. We've now entered into the great heart of humanity, where all suffrage of all children is my suffrage, where the suffrage of war and disease and poverty of all beings, all sentient beings, is my suffrage, is my great pain. And then one's poetry and the space between the words of one's poetry really begins simply to position itself there, not in order to constantly reprogram, but in order to put out the words that can be heard in the great desolation by others. Because there's nothing more lonely than loneliness. And, true loneliness, when we're sitting in that space and the loved one has died, or life is reduced now down just to the bare bones, and all of the color and the superfluity of life has now been threshed away. All that's left is the bare bones. I'm describing now everyone's journey toward death, okay? I'm describing everyone's journey through the death of a beloved, a husband or a wife, a lover, a son, a daughter, a mother, father. When the bare bones are left, all we want to feel is not alone.
Because I know you've written about bones. Let me find that one, because I was going to read that one later, but we should maybe this one. Okay, can I read it?
Please.
I hope I do justice. I had to choose ones that had words I could pronounce. So I didn't want to butcher any of your poems. So, fate, my love. Do you recall that time I told you we would plant a forest where you might rest in peace? Yet I see that it is my bones which are to be buried deep in the heart of this forest tonight.
Well chosen poem, incidentally, because yes, that actually underscores exactly what I've just been speaking about, is that my bones is the bones of the ego. And once my bones have been buried in the forest, I've moved into that transcendent space. The fear of fear is fear is fear. And fear is only something which emerges in connection to the absence of what we call love. And love is what we define through relationship with self, because it is only when we have aligned relationship with self that we are become capacitors of what you would call love, which is the universal stream that keeps all sentience moving. But to become conscious of it whilst in the flesh is the essential piece here. That's where we can move into higher strains of expression, like bliss, serendipity, where we become so convergent with the Godhead that our living expression becomes an instrument or an extension of Alpha Omega, of divine expression. And when one is aligned in that way, and then one can see the results, I mean, in one's life. So ultimately, I think I'm describing what each of us seek, which is beyond just finding relevancy. Yeah, we all want relevancy. We all want to matter. We all want a voice. We all want to be seen. We all want to be heard. But the greatest amongst us arrive at a point where being seen is absolutely of no consequence, where being heard is of no consequence. Because in the temporal world, the temporal realm, to be heard and to be seen is to be part of a Luciferic exchange of false light worship. I know what I'm talking about here. The whole business of being a rock and roll musician and moving into that world of iconoclasticism in my youth, and then over the years becoming something of a kind of influencer type. I don't know what you would describe my remit in life, but it's definitely got to do with people's attention to what I say. So that's the exchange there. And I have to police that exchange constantly. I have to constantly police it, lest I fall foul and fall victim to the travesty, the abomination of idolatry, and allowing that exchange to become something which empowers me with false light, which would be devastating to me. And so again, poetry is my way of keeping myself in check. And I'll tell you straight up, if I start to put pen or prose to paper and there's a block, that is symptomatic of an egoic form in myself, an intellectual aggrandizement that has now acted as an obstacle to that fluid communion. And so that's my way of knowing. So I take serious stock and check of self at that moment if there's not absolute fluid alignment through prose. So again, a useful barometer for keeping oneself in check. The problem today, or there's many problems one could speak of, but one of the most prevailing ones is the adherence to false light, the addiction that it's created amongst swathes of younger generations who are seeking relevancy only through the most facile interfacing with social media. So sticking my tits out and sticking my tongue out, as a 14-year-old girl, or a boy kind of strutting and punching another kid in the face in the schoolyard and posting that. Those are we discussed this briefly in our last conversation about porn stars and cage fighters exemplifying the fallen female and the fallen male. And ironically, it's these pornographicized young girls, whether they are Britney Spears, or whether they are these cage fighters. I'm so out of that ilk. I can't even name one of them. But the point being, they've become the icons of millions and millions of younger generations. Just look up to them, even though all they're doing is playing into the most bestial element of our nature, which is satanic. It's beyond luciferic. It's satanic. It's Saturnian logic. It's flipped 180 degrees. And that's become the premise of how we are culturally or cultivating our younger people into life, against the grain of what I would bring forth, which is poetry. So I would reduce all teaching. I would eradicate 98% of all teaching, all learning. I plan to do it, incidentally. We're just beginning work on the 0-point curriculum of the New Earth School we won't even be using that term, that we plan to build next year. And I'm beginning the process of developing that 0-point curricula. What does it look like? How can we best be stewards or custodians, ushers to young souls, bringing them into this world and helping them stave off that tidal wave of pornography and of trivia and of false light egoism that otherwise they're being invited into in every aspect of their lives. That becomes a profoundly important question, and one that I am very, very serious about. And it's got to do with, again, poetry. So we'll be bringing younger people into reconvention with nature through telluric and paramagnetic and dielectric forces, taking them back to reconnection with the sacred soil, the living soil, and then also the space between words and reconvention of relationship with each other and with instructors or stewards or custodians or teachers or experts, whoever's brought in to help exemplify arts and sciences and crafts. That's got to be a relationship that's based on pure equanimity and balance. It cannot be a student-teacher relationship. This is a perversion. And so it goes on. I'm going off in a slightly different direction, except to say that the most important aspect of that curriculum will be understanding or being in a state of witness, in order that the space between words is heard more presciently and more powerfully than the words themselves.
So good. Okay, let's read another poem. So this one, I think it's, okay. At the edge of time, near the end of days, where the angle of light can blind the gaze, and the cross that we bear is our fate foretold, for the pain that we feel is the love we withhold. Love in a tempest. I love those last two lines, Sacha. For the pain that we feel is the love we withhold.
Well, that was stolen, and that's why I think I wrote the poem. I've not heard it since I wrote it. It sounds fluid. It's an honest piece of prose. But that's a beautiful saying that I heard, which comes from the Andromedan constellation, the Andromedan beings, who that's their gift to humanity, is the pain that you feel is the love that you withhold. And in that, again, that's Andromedan poetry, and it's poetry at its finest, because in one line, one breath, one utterance, one understands redemption and salvation at the same time. The pain that I feel is the love that I withhold. That has just redeemed me from my sorrow, from my misery, from feeling alone. It's not about me. It was never about me. I must let go of the idea of me and simply recognize the universal truth that we only feel pain proportionate to the degree to which we are failing to fill the space with love and with affirmation and with the elevation again of art and beauty and consciousness, which is what should be. We should all be afflicted by that. That should be our addiction, and our affliction should be affirming and creating and expanding incessantly. That's what we are hardwired to be and to do. We are Godhead made manifest in the temporal realm. We're capacitors of limitless genius and supernature and divine flame. And when we're not being harvested and harnessed and mind-fucked by lower elemental intelligences and archonic and demonic forces that operate also through temporal proxies in this world, aka politicians and bankers and priests, when we get rid of the third-party interventionism and move into our true flow, each one of us, even the hardest bastard out there who's listening to this, who's such a tough guy that it's hard for him to even listen to a podcast about poetry, you are touched by it for a reason. You lean in to hear this for a reason. You know, I know that what I'm saying resonates with hard men because I happen to love hard, strong men more than any other kind of man. I like tough guys. I like gun-toting farmers and veterans and men who have softened and feminized their spirit, having gone through the fight of men and survived. They're my favorite creature, the feminized, the male that's defining now his heart and his feminized aspect. I regard myself to some extent as being one of those creatures. I think I used to be a lot harder than I am nowadays. I wasn't as soft.
You found your heart.
I know I was always there. I mean, my heart, I never needed to find the heart. My affliction, Gemma, was that I was born in that space and died to it 1,000 times since the age of 5, you know, and I think we may have even touched on that, you know. So I've never been out of sync with that piece, but yeah. Anyway, I don't dwell on myself.
Okay, so I have another one. And I'd really like to understand this one, the first couple of lines and the last couple of lines especially. A king without a kingdom, a rose without a thorn, the dream within a dream, within a never-ending storm, a sigh within a tempest, a wheel within a wheel, the pulse within a vein, within a heart which daren't feel. Listen close, O brazen heart, for aught it may be worth. A king without a kingdom is king of all the earth.
Good poem. I rather like that. Again, I've not heard it since I wrote it, and I don't know how long ago I wrote it.
2019.
Okay, that's for three odd years ago. Don't know what to say, but speaking again to the same thematic of alpha omega and of defining one's relevancy in this world through defining one's divine flame and aligning to that divine flame. And again, you could be sitting in the most miserable and dejected and ignominious circumstances, absolutely stone broke, living in some shithole of a place, and this truth comes to you. And when this truth comes to you in that condition, in that circumstance, and some people listening in to this are going to be in a pretty grim circumstance, you know, of poverty and of sorrowfulness and of a sense of dejection. And yet when they do define their godliness and their supernature, their divine flame in that space, of poverty and dejection, the empowerment that floods into the veins, and how that turns everything around. And that's not to say that to be poor or sick or miserable is an affliction or is a punishment. It's not. It's what we do to ourselves. It's how we refract and reflect the geometry of life back to self in order to bring ourselves into these quintessential moments of defining self in the now, in order to constantly invite a reconvention of relationship with our divinity in the now. And when we've hurt enough, we get to the point where we do meet with self in a perfect moment in time. And that moment of time, of course, as I've said 1,000 times, becomes the springboard to timelessness. And timelessness describes the transmutation and then transcendence from the mortal realm of time and motion and fear and money and scarcity and entropy and death. We move in that moment of timelessness into our supernature, into the state of witness, which is beyond birth and death, beyond good and evil, beyond the angelic and the demonic. It becomes the perennial witness. And that's where we're all seeking to take our throne, because that's the one quantum zone where we can never feel sorrow again, never feel alone again, never feel ignominious or unworthy again. And surely that's what we're all seeking ultimately, is the throne of self, which is why the true message of the true master, Jesus, in the Christian context is I am. I am. The I am is absolutely essential, is to take full cognizance, full authorship, full sovereign responsibility for the alphabet of one's own heart and for the architecture of one's own reality. And whilst we're speaking about poetry and the importance of it, because also I've got to shoot in 3 minutes, one of the most important things, people wouldn't necessarily understand this, I do as a poet get this, is mathematics. Because mathematics is a transcendent language. Now I've got the attention of engineers and scientists who are leaning in now going, the boy gets it. Yeah, I do get it. I totally get it. Pure mathematics is so transcendent and so powerful, cannot begin to express my admiration for true math. And I know that for me, I've spoken about the Andromedan poetry and the poetry of Garcia Lorca, the poetry of the Master Yeshua and of Rumi, and others being so important to me. I can tell you that in terms of my own shamanic death and rebirth and the evolution of my own soul's journey in this world, it was not attributable to the poetry of any of those great avatars. It was attributable to the equation by a very, very brilliant Belgian mathematician whose name was Bernard Mandelbrot, who died, alas, a few short years ago. But Bernard Mandelbrot stumbled on an equation which was Z equals Z square plus C. That in 1997, which is when I had my complete shamanic death and rebirth, was what saved me, what redeemed me and brought me out of madness back into the land of the living, so to speak. I went so deep into sorrow at that time, in that year, that the only thing that saved me was me being cast into the quantum void, drowning in the emeraldine oceans of despair to such an incredible point of agony, where the agony accreted into a universal truth that emerged in my mind's eye in my space of madness and suffrage at that time. And all that emerged was an equation. And it was just that. It was Z equals Z squared plus C. How's that? I then found out later that that equation was the equation circumscribed by a man called Bernard Mandelbrot, which became the root to all supercomputers today. So I'd entered into, through my sorrow, I'd entered into the atom seed of the matrix. I don't know how else to explain it. Any mathematician who knows Z equals Z squared plus C describes the equation of infinity. That's what it is. But I only found that out weeks later when I came back with this equation, was asking around, does anyone know what this means? When I could walk and talk properly after my momentary madness. And it was explained to me at a given point. And that was a huge eureka moment. That was the equation of infinity. So at that point, I recognized that I had done the shamanic death to such an extent that you could not die any further. I would have disembodied at that point. But what I came back with, the jewel that was burned into me, was the universal equation of infinity. So sorry to go on the subject, but I just want to underscore here that poetry is not just, long-haired hippies and losers like myself writing pretty words that do their best to conjure. That's not poetry. That's not what I'm talking about. The space between words is also the space between numbers. It's an important subject, this, that you kindly and graciously reached out to me to communicate on. Poetry is so much more. The greatest equations ever written are absolute poetry in motion as well. Let's not forget that.
So fascinating, because you can articulate things so well, like all these concepts I've never heard of. I just write and express, but to actually have the theory and everything around it is massive. So,
well, that is the point. That's the point of poetry. Again, you beautifully bring me back to this. The point of transcendence, which is the point of alchemization, is to be connected to supernature in the now, which is to be connected to the Alpha Omega, the universal mind in the now, which knows the answers to all things at all times, in all ways, and can speak limitlessly on any subject. When each of us align to that extraordinary propensity that we have of alignment with our divinity, we can all engage ad nauseum with endless fascination, because the truth of the matter is that it is endlessly fascinating. The heart of reality is extraordinarily beautiful and complex and profound and magical and mysterious and infinitely enchanting. And again, that's where we should be situating our minds and our hearts, not on whether we can, make the tax bracket this year, or whether we can, get with the desired, lover, or whether we can, acquire a Chihuahua or Pomeranian at Christmas time. Whatever our little fetishes are, we really ought to move so much beyond them into our limitless capacities as divine sons and daughters of God, and therein find true expression and true bliss and true affirmation and true ecstasy. That's the real orgasm. Yeah, right there.
Yeah, I mean, the writing and the poetry, it really is. I feel connected with the angels and heaven and divinity and everything else that comes through, and really takes us to a higher place. So I'll read another one. I think this was one of your more recent ones. I stumbled on a part of me, like driftwood on the shore. Mine hollowed heart, full cleft apart, was stilled forevermore. And through the gloaming I espied, lain broken as a bird. Mine song now dead, all meaning shed, a stiller sound not heard. I stumbled on a part of me, eternal me amore. Where fell this life to Hera's knife, alone? Cephalophore. I'm sorry. I know what it is. I looked
What's
up
the
what
last
it is.
line?
It's a headless statue. Cephalophore.
Oh, yes, yes. Well, yes, I was referring to an ancient icon there. The saint that carries around its own cephalophore, carries its own head around with it. It's just that's just totemistic of the ultimate sacrifice that we make in this world as a Christed being, or as a shaman, as a healer, as a mother, as a true lover, as a true father, as a true brother, as a true sister. Any of us who are a true anything are saintly in that being. So whoever you are, wherever you are, in whatever circumstances you live, if you align to the frequencies of what we're speaking about here, it means that, simply put, you are accomplished, that you have arrived, and that you, whether your role could be playing the crone, could be the wizened old crone, and that's a beautiful, powerful archetype that some elders are profoundly intelligent enough to align to that archetype, and then embody that archetype and become extraordinary vessels for wisdom and learning of others. The point I'm making is that everyone is so relevant and so vital and so valid in this world, even the motherfuckers amongst us, the real shady nasties. I've spoken about the Faucis and the Gateses of this world being Zen masters in their way, which they are. And when we can see that, we're seeing the poetry of life right there. And more than that, we're seeing the word, but the spaces between the words in the poetry of life, when we can recognize that everything is comprised in that sense of perfect divine geometry. All the horrors of this world are there for a perfectly anointed reason. Nothing is happenstance. Nothing is just haphazard. Everything is perfectly aligned in the now.
So good. Okay, this one's from 2018.
It'll have to be the last one, darling, because I have to run to the airport in 4 minutes, 5 minutes.
Oh, okay. Well, I'll read it quickly, but then I also wanted to read the one that you inspired me to write at the end. So if you could just leave a couple of minutes for that. Okay. So this one you wrote in 2018. I dreamt we met beneath a tree, long overgrown with mystery, wetted by galactic tears, where it had stood for many years. And there we kissed each other's eyes and thus became immortalized. I like this idea of people being immortalized in poetry.
Again, the theme there is of the beloved. And who's the beloved? The beloved is me, was me and my relationship with me, and me one fine day having the courage, the steel to face off self and to deal with the shadow in that sense, and to be able to hold the gaze with oneself unflinchingly, which is to say, to realign fully with one's own conscience in the now and one's own divinity in the now, and to become completely peaceable about that relationship when nothing is uncomfortable any longer. And where it is, we address it, we adjust it accordingly. But that poem speaks about, again, the immortalization of one's relationship with oneself, and becomes the divine spark, and then enters into something which the ancient sadhus would refer to as, or even the modern sadhus would refer to as, the bodhisattva, which is the state of availing oneself to be of service to others. And one can escape this world because one has already earned the stripes, so to speak, to be able to do so, but you choose to remain, and you choose to continue to be of service to others. And that becomes your métier, that becomes your reason for being, is simply to remain in service. That ultimately, that state of bodhisattva is the highest calling of the actualized human being.
Thank you. So when I was getting ready for this show about a week ago, I printed off your poetry and I sat down to read it all. And about halfway through reading it, I had to stop because I had a poem come through myself. And I mean, literally, I just wrote it down. It just, when it flows, as you said. And I always like, if someone's inspired any of my poetry, I always like to send it to them, so I did. But I'd also like to read it here because it's about your poetry. And when I feel that it comes through like that, I feel that it is meant to be shared with the person who inspires it. So it's called His Chest. You handed me a chest, a sacred treasure trove of words, wrapped up in your heartaches, sorrows, and woes. I opened the lid and peeked there within, beyond the glaring gold nuggets, past what mortals can know. Bedazzled by your jewels, feeling the depth of your words, hearing the music of angels gracing hearts here on earth. The holy alchemy of poetry, divine transcendence of rhyme, pure vibrations from heaven sung between lyrics and line. Not all are yet to see you, not all can yet know the purity of love etched in the poetry of your soul.
That's very wonderful. And you shall be spared assassination because that was a good poem.
I felt a bit like the lamb to slaughter because I know you're a brutal poetry critic, but I know it came from that divine space. So I was happy to put myself on the slaughter.
Thank you, Gemma. Much appreciated. Very lovely words. Thank you.
You're welcome. Thanks, Sacha, for telling us all your beautiful words about poetry and for allowing me to read your beautiful words and the space between the words.
Great fun. Thank you, Gemma. Look forward to the next time. God bless you.
Safe travels.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye. So I hope you enjoyed that, and I'll be back on Manspeak in another couple of days. Okay, bye.